Hello, and welcome to the Deep Edge Podcast. I'm your host, Ray Mota from ACG, and in this episode, we're going to dig deep into understanding the ballooning costs associated with hitting cost of cloud and discuss some of the things that are moving from a niche concept of FinOps to becoming an important core practice within business and CFOs embracing that concept. Today, I'm excited because I'm joined by Matt Biringer, who's co-founder of North Cloud, a platform built to automate the financial health of your public cloud spending. So if cloud agility matters, but cost clarity keeps you up at night, let's get this podcast started. Hey, Matt, welcome to the Deep Edge Podcast. How you doing?
Thanks, Ray. Great to be here. Doing good.
Excellent, excellent. I hear you have a newborn, so I hope you got enough sleep and ready to get going with this podcast.
I do, and sleep is, I guess the saying would be good enough.
Yeah,
So,
that's right. Yeah. My wife hates when I say, what was that? Aoki, Steve Aoki, I'll sleep when I'm dead. She hates when I say that. So I feel you. I'll tell you a funny story, not to divert for the audience, but I remember when we had our daughter, I remember waking up the first day and telling my wife, like, I can't believe she slept through the entire night. My wife looked at me with that look laser beams and says, "You slept through the entire night," right? So, so I learned my lesson there. But maybe to get started for our audience, real quick, Matt, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and about what your company does.
yeah, for sure. So, my name is Matt Biringer. I'm the co-founder over at North Cloud. We are the easiest way to explain our platform is it's essentially like a financial automation system for folks who are using the public cloud. And I spent 12 or 13 years in tech sales. So I was working with CTOs and, heads of technology, so on and so forth. A lot of my career was helping them with data center purchasing. So purchasing servers and racks and storage systems and kind of you name it. I've probably sold it at some point or time. And a lot of the last few years of my career before starting North, I just was able to experience firsthand how many CTOs and business leaders were really struggling with understanding cloud cost economics. Why is my bill going up, down, sideways, et cetera, trying to tie back really complex cost units and cost logging systems into business units so they can do show back and other sorts of things like that. So, when I started North, really was kind of an experiment to see if we can create a software product that
Sure.
could make people's lives a little bit easier and try and automate as much of this away from them. And we're about 3 years old. We've raised a couple rounds of fundraising. We're doing very well as a company. You can get into tons of specifics and industry stuff, but we're essentially a cloud optimization and financial health automation platform.
Excellent, excellent. I mean, I think it's a hot topic, right? Because I think one of the key parts when we look at from an industry perspective, right, is that initially people were hesitant about the cloud, but then they saw about the agility and quickness and go to market, right? Especially when you don't have a lot of the skill sets. But I think you touched on something which is I think it's important in this whole evolution of cloud spending complexity, right? And if we look at enterprises, right, it seems that many of them are showing concerns because they have multiple clouds across multiple regions. And I even see in some cases where because they don't have that visibility, right? That visibility of whether it's a unified view, you're seeing this cost leakage and many of them are even having to repatriate from that point of view. What's your view on the market about the complexities going on with cloud evolution, especially when it looks to multi-cloud?
Well, if you go back and you've been in the industry a bit, right? So if you go back like 10, 12 years ago, the way that this all used to work is somebody would sit for 3 or 6 months with different vendors. They would do capacity planning to figure out how many servers do I need in each location that we have, how many terabytes of data do I need in the storage systems that back end all of this. And at the end of that long process becomes like, basically there's a purchase that happens at some point. Somebody creates a purchase order and a bunch of boxes with really expensive gear show up to a data center and somebody's in charge of racking and stacking it. But that was really like that was how people purchased enterprise data center gear, pre-cloud. So we have this like pre-cloud kind of early cloud and post-cloud world that I think that we live in. And then when the cloud first started becoming something that enterprises were taking seriously, the obvious benefits were agility, speed to test new products, speed to turn on products. You didn't have to send a tech to a data center and do a bunch of wiring work and testing to make sure a server was online. Like you could literally press a button, and that's still the case. So like the core business benefits of the cloud are still there, like speed of turning machines on, speed of testing, agility. There's we can go on and on about the different business benefits of cloud. The trade-off to that obviously is that there's retroactive billing. So you no longer have to sit there and say, okay, we need a certain amount of servers, we need a certain amount of databases, we got to buy X amount of gear, this is our budget. In the cloud, you basically just click a button to turn on what you need, and then you get billed later on for what you use. So it turns from like a purchasing cycle that took a lot of analysis into this utility kind of retroactive billing cycle. The trade-off for that type of shift from a business perspective is the reason why our business and businesses like ours exist, is because in order to do retroactive utility-based billing, you need to charge people per second for anything that happens in their system. Somebody touches a file and moves it to a different region, that's going to take an egress charge. Somebody turns on a copy of a database. Now there's two databases and you're getting charged for that, right? So this creates a total paradigm shift for the way customers manage financial health. The financial health used to be part of the pre-sales process, right?
Right.
Now it's this ongoing, continuous thing that all companies have to manage. And there's like a few different layers to it, I think. There's obviously like kind of the 100 level, which is like visibility. So
Mhm.
if you're using the cloud today, like chances are you get an invoice from AWS. It's like 50 pages long. It's filled with, or GCP or whoever your cloud
Right.
provider is. It's filled with like tons of line items and SKUs, and things are relatively confusing just looking at that document, right? The first layer is like, how do we get a visibility tool that turns this into a dashboard that makes it a little simpler for us to digest and understand? And then the next layers beyond that are like, how do we automate licensing? How do we automate over provisioning, reducing like servers and databases that are over provisioned? How
Right.
do we automate spend alerting, budgeting,
Mhm.
cost allocation? How do we turn all of this data on what all this stuff is costing us into business insights that help us understand like how our business is running? Because I think like the one interesting thing that's happened is I think a lot of the new age companies, particularly SaaS companies, and you can go through the last 10 years of startups, like almost none of them had a data center at any point.
Right.
Uber, Lyft, Ramp, Mercury, like all of these really cool hot startups that everyone loves, and I love them too.
Right.
Like essentially none of them really ever had a data center. Like they've always been in the cloud. So having some sort of system that gives you the visibility, it automates some of the cloud financial health that you want. And then the third tier of that is like helping you understand, like essentially these are the systems that back end your whole company, right? So if a developer or a development team is testing a new feature on your app, and users are clicking and playing with that new feature, like there's infrastructure costs behind that to run
Right.
that feature. So
Right.
now helping customers automate and understand like, hey, a certain portion of my bill is for this new feature we're testing. Is that a high ROI like feature, or is that feature costing us more money in infrastructure costs than it's gaining us in efficiency or revenue?
Right.
So I think there's a few like kind of layers to the evolution. But it's been interesting to see what companies do with our platform and what companies are thinking about in the space. It's definitely a really hot space right now.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on something that I think is important is the level of innovation that cloud has allowed, right? Because I think I'm old enough back when if you were a startup, you had to buy a server, right? And that took a few
Yeah.
months, right? You had to get the memory, decide what operating system, and that took a while. And then you had to provision an IP address before you knew it, you're 6 months into this in about 20 to 30 grand.
Yeah.
invest them, not knowing if your startup idea would work, right? And now you could just go in there, click, and in a matter of a few minutes be able to provision. So I think that level of innovation is good. But the cost part, I think, is the important part because you mentioned egress. I do see a lot of people not understanding the true egress costs and other dynamics for that, which kind of like I see certain parts of what are your thoughts like? I see working with a few enterprises, service providers, this whole thing about FinOps becoming mainstream, right? And one of the things that I'm seeing, I want to get your thoughts on FinOps because from my point of view, we're seeing it mature from kind of like a niche discipline, right? To more of a core business practice, right? But I do see certain organizations and certain teams struggle with the cultural and alignment and cultural adoption of engineering, finance, and operations and stuff like that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you hit a lot of really interesting things. I think that the practice of cloud FinOps is going to be a really core practice in all engineering orgs for a really long time. I don't think that's going anywhere. I think it's going to continue to grow. I think the challenge that FinOps hits, if you kind of like peel the layer of the onion back a little bit, it's like, oh, how do we get FinOps? Well, it was really like an engineering practice to understand cost economics and understand how you can right size and reduce costs and how you can create kind of like a common language for people to collaborate in a healthy way when it comes to cloud costs. What you don't want to do is you don't want to like be a company and you're spending a bunch of money in the cloud, and then your CFO will one day gets upset and says, "Why is our bill so high?" And all of a sudden, everyone's scrambling. Like you really want to have those like collaborative conversations on what is the budget, what are we spending on, why are we spending it, what machines are back-ending what, and really have a lot of collaboration. And that collaboration should include product, it should include finance, it should include engineering, it should include the development teams and the DevOps folks and all that. The problem that like I've seen personally, there's a few problems. One is like all of those teams essentially speak different languages, and that's just a byproduct of the fact they have different job functions.
Right.
Trying to explain to the head of finance like what a reserved instance or a committed use discount is
Yeah.
like it's kind of crazy. Like it's
Yeah.
really hard to explain. Like, and at the same time, like that person trying to explain like EBITDA and
Yeah, right.
monetization
NPV and
and
all
all
that,
that
right?
stuff
Yeah.
to a development like to a DevOps leader is they're like, I don't even know or care to know what any of this stuff is.
Right.
So these folks tend to speak very different languages. The other problem is that this is something like our system is trying to improve over time, is that a lot of the systems, like there's a real political element to FinOps that I don't think gets talked about enough,
Okay.
which is like there's a human element to it. And what I mean by that is, if you're a technology leader and you're in charge of making sure the cloud spend doesn't go too crazy out of whack, there's an aspect of your job where you don't really want people to be micromanaging that or inspecting it. And you don't want to spend too much time trying to explain like FinOps basics to people that don't have a FinOps or development or tech
Right.
background. And I've seen that a lot in organizations, and it's a big challenge with like getting organizations to all buy into FinOps, is you need to make sure the leaders of those tech orgs understand like, we should be on calls with the head of finance to understand what our financial goals are. We should be on calls with product to understand like why are we developing these features? What are they doing for our business? How are we making money off of these features so that we can like map the costs back to what our real business impact are. The problem with that is that you get a lot of politics and you get people that don't want other people inspecting their job and they feel like they
Right.
get micromanaged by other parts of the business that don't understand tech as much as they do. So that piece of it is definitely a really, really big challenge. I think the way that we try and approach it, just talking personally about North, and
Mhm.
there's other companies that I'm sure approach it in different and maybe even better ways, whatever. But the way that we try and approach it is creating services and data services within the app that take a lot of the data-led human analysis out of the human's hands So the way we approach that is instead of giving a user this giant mine of data and say, hey, here's all this data, here's all these charts, we try and understand like what are the use cases the user really is trying to work backwards to more often than not. And then we'll build a more intelligent service to give them that result. And what we've seen is that if we can give that person that thing, they're more likely to share it with other people in the organization because they don't feel like if I hand all these people all this data on my environment, they're going to have all these data-based questions.
Right.
And if I just hand them the answer and then we can talk about the reality of the answer, then it's a little bit more collaborative, but it's definitely a really, really big challenge in a lot of companies.
Yeah, no, I mean, facilitating that cross-functional collaboration could be a challenge for many organizations. Maybe to just add on to this and some of the parts I see is regarding the collaboration, but also about governance and compliance, right? With so many organizations kind of addressing this multi-cloud strategy, right? Enforcing policies around budgets, tagging security is becoming harder and harder, right? What are your thoughts about the governance and compliance in this type of environment, and how
I
you
think
guys address that, I guess, too?
Yeah, I think that the way that we think about it, and once again, like the market may tell us we're wrong in the future, I don't know. But
Yeah.
the way that we think about it is when you're building a service, take budgeting for example, right? We just built a feature called cost streams. It's super cool. It's not to plug
Mhm.
our platform too much, but basically does like automated cost allocation. And one of the features um, in that is that the app will look at all of the historical data of that chunk of the cloud bill, and it'll assign it basically an AI budget. So it'll look at when they have spikes of usage, like you have a ton of compute you use in Christmas and New Year's or in the holiday season. So
Mhm.
it'll know that. It knows how much they spend historically, right? And the reason that we did that is A, because asking someone to like think of what a budget should be for XYZ is kind of asking like a little bit of the wrong question because that's just too subjective to that person's opinion on so it's not a data-driven thing.
Right.
The other
Okay.
thing that we've seen is like a lot of companies, and this probably isn't the case in like the Fortune 500, but we work a lot with like small enterprise and mid-market companies that they're looking more for a software that like makes the problem go away versus having a giant team that manages it. So like that's really where our target market is. But just coming back to kind of what we've seen is a lot of companies they there's ancillary financial intelligence things they could be doing, such as stuff for compliance, budgeting, um, alerting, anomaly detection. But a lot of that requires a human at some point going into the tool that they're using, creating rule sets and policies, and then that turns into, well, we have to meet with all these teams and all these developers, and we have to look at data, and then it turns into this big analysis paralysis. What we've seen is like machine learning AI is really huge for those things. Because if you could just have a system that automates like, hey, we know your business goals, we know how much you spend, we know that you want to reduce your spend 10% this year. Since we have all the data and we know what your goals are, like the app can actually do all this for you. So it can actually go in and set all the budgets on all your different cloud accounts that tie back to your long-term and short-term business goals. We can go in and we can use your historical data to train an ML agent that does anomaly detection without you having to set up, 25 different alerts on all the different accounts you have and all that stuff. So I think that long term, I think if you have any industry that is very math and like quantitative based and is very confusing to most people, and like cloud and cloud optimization is like the perfect fit for that. I think that long term, more often than not, like the winner of that category from a product perspective is going to be the product that uses the most AI and machine learning to automate that. And we've seen like that's not like a new concept. Like there's other, there's Quant trading shops have been doing this forever, right? Where you can have a trader sitting at a desk looking at stocks all day long, or you can just essentially train your own machine learning model to know when to buy and when to do puts and calls and
Yeah.
all that based on what your goals are and what you
Okay.
want to invest in or what you want to, trade or whatnot. So we think like it'll feel a lot like that ultimately
Okay.
long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to add on to that because I think, you're talking about AI, you talked about automation, and this whole concept about AI-driven automation for cloud management becomes an important one, right? But one of the things I see in organizations is this uncertainty related to safety, right? About automating budgets and control and right sizing and stuff like this, right? So, how do you address some of this stuff by making sure they maintain a level of transparency and trust for the users in that environment?
Well, the way that we do it for the North product is we try to automate as much as we can up until like a certain risk point. What I
Okay.
mean by that is like if we're automating all the budgets for your, for your cloud alerting and we're wrong about that,
Hmm.
it's a pretty light mistake. What I mean by that is like somebody can just go into the portal and into the North app and change the budget or can say, hey, this actually our budget should be a little bit less or a little bit more. Like there's still the like we want the humans to essentially be like the approvers and the overseers of what's going on in the app, not necessarily the people that are going to be super involved in doing all of the nitty-gritty busy work on it. Now, that the other caveat and layer to that is there's things that our app will do, particularly around like right sizing environments and flagging when a machine is over provisioned or whatnot. And our general opinion on those is that you need to be incredibly careful automating that
Okay.
because you are if you fully automate that and you take that totally away from the user to at least approve it or review it, you're opening yourself up for a variety
Oh,
of
yeah. Yeah.
issues from a risk perspective. Obvious issues could be what if your app is wrong and the code miscalculates something, which can happen.
Right.
A human can miscalculate something too, to be fair.
Right.
Um, the other layer to that is like, all right, what happens if we get breached, if we get a bad actor in the North environment? So we think very deeply about like scenario planning as far as like, okay, we're going to build this thing. But let's also play out like what happens when this gets breached and what
Right.
happens if a bad actor gets in. What is the worst thing they can do? What is the worst thing they can look at? And we're very, very, very thoughtful on that. And it's tricky to build products when you're that thoughtful with that stuff because if you're that thoughtful with it, you tend to like the way that we do it is we tend to really limit, like there's very specific air gaps that we've put into the application.
Okay.
So these are like things where the app can tell you to do something, but it can't actually do it for you. You can create something to have the app do it if you really want it to, but it needs to be done from the customer, not from in other words, there's basically a gap where the customer has to open up the gate and say, okay, I want North to do XYZ now.
Right.
There's also air gaps of processes for us, and there's a real limitation. Like we're really, really, really incredibly careful on like what data our app takes in from customer environments. And if we're not using like a chunk of the data, we will create some sort of customization where we don't even have access to it or we don't house the data.
Okay.
Because our thought process is like, even if we're not using this little column of this data report or something like that for this service that we're building, if that data can be construed or taken out of our system by a bad actor, and then somebody else can use that data for something else that maybe is not traceable back to North, we don't even want that possibility to exist. So we're like, what is the minimum amount of data we need to take? So I think like we're very obsessed with like, the role of like least permissions and
Yeah.
making sure we're taking the least amount of data and putting air gaps into things. But it's definitely like it's an ongoing thing. And for us personally as a company, like we go through various things throughout the course of the year We go through application reviews, white hat hacking that we hire
Mhm.
outside firms, multiple different outside firms to try and breach our systems to find vulnerabilities and stuff. So I think if you're going to do anything with ML and AI or anything in SaaS in general, and especially if you're dealing with any sort of data from customers, I think this is probably different if you're building like an app that like an Uber for dog walkers or
Mhm.
something like that type of app. Like, but if you're doing something in B2B that handles really sensitive data, you need to be like obsessive about data security and
Right.
scenario planning and almost trying to hack
Right.
yourself to figure out like where are our weak spots on this thing and how do we make this really secure.
Yeah, no, I think it's good for that you're doing that due diligence because I don't know if you've seen this, Matt, but you because you mentioned humans make mistakes too. Because sometimes I've seen some LLMs and I remind the person, well, it was trained after you, and you make mistakes too. But
Yeah.
it seems that people don't tolerate an AI making a mistake, So the fact that you're doing this extra due diligence, I think, helps reduce the risk of trying to move forward in the implementation of that side of it. So we have some time left. What I want to do is I read some parts on your website, Matt, and maybe we can go
Sure.
deeper into your product and some of the bullet points and stuff like this. So uh, if maybe we could get even a deeper dive and more technical here from moving from an industry. Now, I was reading about your North 2.0 product, and there's a part in there about AI FinOps Copilot architecture, right, where you introduce an agent from that side of it, right? Could you explain the end-to-end architecture on how that agent North, how ingest telemetry traffic and how you do the training associated with that and the value that it brings?
Yeah, sure. So I can give as much as I can
Sure, sure.
without exposing too much IP, but
No, no,
basically,
just whatever's public. Yeah, whatever's public.
yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, what we built, it's called Agent North. It's super cool. It's actually still in beta, so we're doing
Oh, it
some
is. Okay.
thing on
So,
it.
yeah. Mhm.
But so it should actually be live in the app for all customers. There's a
Okay.
couple of test cases that we're running just to make sure it doesn't hallucinate.
Sure.
But essentially, it's an LLM wrapper.
Okay.
And but what it does is really interesting. So in cloud finance, there's like we view it as like there's essentially like kind of 4 to 5 different data sources or places you can get data, right? So if I went to ChatGPT and I said, "Hey, how do I create an auto scaling policy on my EC2 cluster?" It's going to read public internet data. It's going to read all the AWS technical books and all that stuff, and it's going to give you probably 99% of the time it's going to give you the right answer. Every once in a while it won't, but most of the time it's going to give you the right answer. So that's like one layer of it is like, hey, we obviously can have a node of this LLM read from technical documents and kind of public knowledge on how AWS or Google Cloud or Azure or whatever, or how all this works. And all
Mhm.
the providers are really good with having like really beefy documentation. So it's pretty good at reading the documentation and finding like a general use case question and answer.
Right.
There's also, the cloud gets really, really complex when you get into like the data of the billing. So I think most people don't know, but like when you get a cloud bill, you get an invoice. There's actually like a log file that backends that technology called in AWS called the cost and usage report. There's a few other versions of it in the other providers, but essentially it's a log file that pings per second what everything you're doing is and what the price of everything you're doing is.
Okay.
So if you have like a machine you've turned on for 30 seconds, like those 30 seconds are logged into this cost file and I don't know, partial pennies per second of usage cost or whatever. So that log file, every customer has it. I don't think people realize probably how big it is, but it's hundreds of different columns. I think it's something like 300 columns now. And even for like a pedestrian size spender, let's say you have a customer that's spending 25 or 50,000 bucks a month in the cloud, which for a B2B company is not a huge amount.
Hmm.
It's not small, but it's not a huge amount.
Right.
So even a customer like that, you're probably looking at like a 40 or 50 million line file. So
Mhm.
for a month of spend, right? Now, in order to answer very specific financial questions, like we have users who will be like, "Hey, I noticed my database costs increased a lot last month versus previous months. Can you give me a breakdown of what exactly changed and why did my cost increase happen? If you ask ChatGPT that, it won't know the answer because it's not hooked into your data. Like it does know how to answer that, right?
Right.
So the way that we did it with our LLM is one of the data sources is customer data, and it's
Hmm.
hooked into all of the customer historical data. And the reason that it is because if it's able to drink all that data and read from it and play with it and manipulate it, it now can act as almost like a FinOps advisor, like a
Okay.
virtual advisor for
Nice.
companies.
Yeah.
And we think that this is actually a feature that will increase collaboration of FinOps. So one thing that we've seen that happens all the time is like somebody from product or finance will have a FinOps question, but they don't really have anyone to ask it to. So if they ask the head of engineering or if they ask their DevOps person or something, they might get a partially correct answer, but that person is a human and they're working with they're looking at the same AWS bill the product person was looking at. So they're saying, I'm not sure why it went up. There must have been more usage. Why
Hmm.
did database costs go up? You guys must have used more. That's not really like an intuitive answer. The better way to do that is to ask the agent. The agent will go pull and manipulate and compile the right
Excellent.
data to give you like a data approached answer. And there's other data sources that we use. So basically, like the way we architect it is like there's a landing zone bot that basically will
Hmm.
understand what type of question this is. Is this a general AWS support question? Is this a question that requires me to look at the cost data of a customer, et cetera? And then it will go and and then there's sub agents, and there's a whole architecture of different kind of sub agents talking to each other to give the right answer to the user. But we're really bullish on this feature because
Hmm.
for the most part, nobody's really done this in the FinOps world. Like there's a couple companies who have done like an LLM wrapper, but it only is trained on AWS technical data. But nobody's
Right.
really integrated this with customer spending files and data or like the usage reports, the logs, all that stuff. So it's really exciting because we feel like this actually could be an agent that helps bridge the gap between like the tech part of the world and
Yeah.
the product slash finance part of the world. Because if you have an agent in the middle that can talk the language of finance and then talk the language of product and it knows based on who's asking it how they kind of want to look at their data, I think it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. I'm excited to see, where this goes because I think when I was talking about that cross-functional challenge between departments, this could be potentially a part that can help address that and have the company have better successful outcome. Now, Matt, from a closing point of view, is there anything that related to your company or your product that I should have asked?
No, I think you hit a lot of really great
Okay, I
points.
touched a
Good
lot, right?
conversation. I would say
Good, good.
we probably didn't get into like the stats of the industry and our company just to throw a
Sure,
couple
yeah,
out
if you
there.
want to tell
Like
us a little bit, yeah.
yeah, I mean the average company, if you're listening and you don't use an automation tool for cloud finance, what I would say is the average company typically overspends by about 30%
Okay.
per month on the public cloud, and the average customer using North gains that back within the first month.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's a really exciting platform for us. We've been around for almost 3 years now. We're one of the fastest growing companies in SaaS in general, but certainly the fastest one in our category. So it's been really, really exciting. And I don't think we would be able to do that if we didn't have a fundamentally
That's right.
really fun and cool product to work with. So if you're listening, give us a shout, I guess.
No, no, this is perfect. And I'm glad we got through this without your baby crying and waking up and all that. So,
Yeah.
with Matt, this is Ray Mota. Thanks for joining this edition of the Deep Ed Podcast.